Hey all, earlier today I had a conversation with a friend, Dr. Jon Greenaway, about writing. Jon is an academic writer. He writes about the intersection of horror and theology and politics. Jon was the very first person to subscribe to this YouTube channel, which means so much to me. Jon is currently in the process of getting the hell out of academia, which, yay, but also he is going to be between jobs for a little bit. So if you could check out his Patreon and his writing in the description below, you'd be doing me a solid. Thank you. I am here with Dr. Jon Greenaway, who has a PhD from the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies. He's the author of 2 books, most recently Theology, Horror, and Fiction, a reading from the Gothic 19th century. He's the co-host of Horror Vanguard, a podcast at the intersection of horror and theory. I'll link to his Patreon below where he does monthly essays. You've also got like a YouTube channel. Anything I've missed?
Videos on aesthetics and culture, and weirdly a lot of like critiques of popular American television. I think is the big. Sometimes you don't know what your niche is until you have a chance to kind of make some stuff. And I think some of the most fun things I've made have been about the kind of ideological weirdness of contemporary American TV. I also am planning to make. I've made one extremely long video essay about one of my favorite video games, and I'm planning on occasionally putting out some big long pieces on video games as well.
Awesome. Why did you start a YouTube channel? Like, what couldn't you do in your academic writing?
Well, I thought about this quite a lot because quite a lot of my work has been on the internet as opposed to in like a kind of proper academic forum. There's a couple of big reasons. So firstly is a simple matter of expediency. Academic work is usually precarious and exploited, and often almost hilariously unpaid. If you explain to people how academic publishing works, it's amazing when they go. Nobody gets paid at any stage of the process except for the people who publish the work. So I needed a way of,
and then nobody gets access to it, which is insane.
And then nobody gets access. It's a complete, like, it's hilarious. The system is hilariously broken. But academic writing has this kind of weird psychological effect, which is that you get kind of trained and inculcated in this method of not feeling like you can say anything about a topic until you've understood everything about the topic. So it's what I really love about YouTube essays and kind of writing online is that there is a space in which you can kind of just try stuff. You can kind of just see what happens. When you have like an idea or a thought that you think might be interesting, you get to flesh that out. You get to flesh that out in a public space.
I do notice, like, when I pitch to more academically focused places, they're like, well, what's the citation for this? And I'm like, I'm using my inductive reasoning. I'm just
my brain.
Yeah, it's like, well, yeah, it's like, it's not that I don't have citations. It's like, I'm definitely trying to extrapolate from the facts I have. And it's like, well, you need a citation for this. I'm like, perhaps I haven't had an idea that somebody else hasn't before. Perhaps you would like to publish that.
I think that the downside of this is it makes writing, writing or any kind of creative, critical activity is sort of like putting thought into motion, right? It's a demonstration of like thinking or kind of publicly. And in academia, that can be really, really hard work. It can be, it's like Sisyphean, because you'll never be done, right? You'll never have come to the end of knowledge, right? So you're always constantly trying to push this ever increasing boulder. But I think doing this kind of work in public is it's a lot quicker, it's a lot more immediate, and it's a much more kind of dialogic. You get kind of like immediate feedback. The other thing about academic publishing is that it's so slow. It can take years for something to appear in print, and then months upon months upon months for it to get any kind of attention or you to receive any kind of feedback. And lots of it just isn't read. And I think the kind of great freedom of YouTube is in its and it has all of this has downsides, obviously, but the great advantages are things like immediacy, access, and distribution, which you don't get anywhere else.
It's true. So, I looked at another one of your interviews where you talked about like the works that got you into writing what you writing about the intersection of horror and theology. You named 2 books, I think, Frankenstein and Dracula. Is that right?
Yeah. I was desperately like thinking like, oh God, what did I say? Yeah, professionally in my day job, you know, in my academic career up to this point has been about horror and religion and theology. It's starting to shift away to be more about the kind of politics and philosophy of horror, which is something that's kind of emerged out of working online. But yeah, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley and Stoker's Dracula are the two kind of bookends of 19th century horror writing, and each of them are kind of like very closely engaged with lots of really interesting kind of religious discourse. I think sometimes when we talk about horror, we kind of gloss over that aspect to it. I think for very understandable and very deep-seated cultural reasons, but I think there are some really interesting things in not just those books, but in a kind of tradition of horror writing and horror media that explicitly grounds itself in these kind of like metaphysical questions.
Yeah, like you said something about how Frankenstein is sort of about the responsibility a creator has to its creation, which is such an interesting way to look at it, because I'm not sure theology often grapples with, well, what's God's relationship to us? What's God's responsibility to us?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, right? There's the great moment on the mountaintop where Victor comes face to face with his creature. I very deliberately use the term creature. I don't like referring to it as a monster. It's not. That's really the whole point of the novel, right? This is a conscious creature, and the thing the creature says to Victor Frankenstein is, "Hear me, Frankenstein, right? Hear me, hear my story, because then, only then, can you judge and respond in a way that's righteous, in a way that's fair." And I think this is the big question, right? That you're right. Religion and theology doesn't like to talk about this idea of not what is the responsibility of the theological responsibility of that. You know, whatever God you might believe is up there, what are your responsibilities towards that? But if creation has its own responsibilities too.
Yeah. So why is it that you don't like to use the word monster for that? Because I find that interesting. Do you think monster has a necessarily bad connotation there?
I think with Frankenstein it does, and that's mostly because of the success of Boris Karloff. So like if you talk about Frankenstein, like we think about James Whale's 1931 movie, the iconic image of Karloff in makeup with neck bolts, and I think that's a very powerful image, but it strips out a lot of the actual complexity of the novel. I don't necessarily think it's wrong, but I think so. Like if you look at the root of the word monster, it's a Latinate root, which if you translate it literally is to reveal something, or to point to something, or to show something. So
like demonstrative.
Demonstrative, yeah.
Yeah,
Monsters are kind of revelations of something. But I think we don't necessarily acknowledge that, right? Monster is a kind of pejorative shorthand for something, and I think with Frankenstein especially, when it's such a kind of like rich, kind of complex novel, it's really important to try and kind of peel away the easy label of being like, oh well, it's Frankenstein's monster, because we all kind of know what that means, and in fact, deliberately referring to it as like, no, this is Frankenstein's creature or creation. It means that people are forced to kind of maybe put aside some of that cultural, the accretion of cultural detail that means they sort of dismiss it.
that makes sense. I mean, I personally find it very important in my work and in terms of like what I watch. I'm really interested in the monstrous. And I'm glad that you told me like that Latinate root, because it's like, yeah, that's right.
Right?
But yeah,
Right?
like, so why do you think, like, I remember watching like China Mieville give like a series of speeches about the importance of fantasy and the importance of portraying the monstrous, which is sometimes, like a controversial opinion depending on the left, depending on the time in history. So, do you think it's important to like portray the monstrous?
I think it's hugely important. I think like there's so many ways that we can think about this, right? The monsters are not natural, right? This is true as far back as you want to go. Monsters are the category is socially and politically constructed, right? So what is deemed monstrous in that kind of easy pejorative sense of the term is a heavily contested question. It's not natural. It's something that's accumulated through historical and political forces. And like, I think this is something China Mieville has said, right? You look at the rhetoric of who gets labeled a monster, especially in the realm of politics. Castro was seen as this monstrous figure. Any kind of revolutionary struggle has always been put in monstrous terms, and this goes back to like Edmund Burke talking about the French Revolution. The French Revolution was seen as this kind of monstrous threat. All of these working class people who had come together into this kind of horrifying political body that could do things. I also think it's important to kind of talk about the ways in which monsters are frightening, not because of their otherness, but I think because of their closeness to us. Right? Mm-hmm. What is it that monsters show? They show things about ourselves. The whole point is that we are uncomfortably close to them, not because they're so like us, but because we're so like them. And I think not only is it important to think about the politics of monstrosity, but it's important to think about the often ambiguous and deeply permeable boundary between what we label as monstrous and what we are comfortable with defining as me, as I. And that results in a lot of hate. It results in a lot of fear and revulsion, right? You can go back to Frankenstein to see this. The whole point is not just that the creature looks awful. It's the stitched together body of the poor and the working class that Victor has literally taken out of their graves. The whole point that makes Victor recoil in such horror is that the creature can recite Milton, right? Can talk in the same sort of Enlightenment rational terms that Victor is the one who's supposed to have the mastery over. So monsters provoke fear in people because they are a revelation of an aspect of ourselves. And I think this is, so to connect that to the political, this is the ground of solidarity, right? It's a potential ground of solidarity. China Mieville uses the phrase of monsters for socialism. And I'm like, yeah, this is an important project, right? This is an important idea. fear and revulsion and disgust is so often weaponized as a tool of exclusion, as a kind of like you create the boundary between the friend and the enemy by making the enemy something into a monster, right? But the monster is also the revelation of our closeness. It's that it breaks down that distinction in ways which are really important and should be talked about.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting that some of the more radicalizing forces on the internet right now are like cringe content, like cringe mills, like Libs of TikTok, Kiwi Farms are all about finding vulnerable people and finding reasons to like find them gross, find them
Yeah,
monstrous.
yeah, because that's how you create enemies. Uh, that's how you can create the distinction between the self and the subject and the object. Because you can do anything to the object, right?
Yeah.
There's no ethical to say that some monsters exist on the kind of like interstitial edge of acceptability. They're a boundary figure. And if something is even close to the wrong side of that boundary, you can do anything, right? There's no ethical qualm about that. But if you understand the monster as a revelation not of something kind of completely other, but of something that's kind of like deeply bound up with you, then that weaponization can be kind of defanged.
Yeah. Like I've heard like term I think the term is communities of vulnerability. Like
Yeah,
we don't come together to try and I don't know, because we're all very strong and we're all very complete. We come together because we're humans with human needs,
yeah.
even if those are a little bit revolting to us sometimes.
I mean, this is the other thing about a good monster, right? Monsters remind us of our own like fundamentally embodied nature. Like try as we might to kind of like push that away, we are like we are embodied creatures. We are like meat and blood and all of these other kind of like physical things that this is something that is intimately familiar to anyone like me who has a body that often doesn't behave or doesn't do the things or look the way that it should, quote unquote, right? Like we are embodied creatures and bodies are often so strange and these deeply fragile, beautiful things with such kind of like endless capacities and potentialities within them. Um, and there is because this is the thing about the monster, right? Classically, the monster is incredible, right? It's what Victor Frankenstein manages to do is framed in the novel as a miracle. Like bodies are these incredible wonders that shouldn't really do all of the things they do.
It's true.
Um, I so what I really love about horror is that it understands the kind of horror operates on on two levels simultaneously, which is like on the physical level of kind of like we say this on Horror Vanguard all the time, which is like horror wants to do things to your body. You're right. Horror wants to reach and kind of like physically get you. And maybe the troubling thing is some of the things that horror wants to do to your body you will kind of like, and maybe you didn't know that you liked that. uh, but also
Yeah.
horror is this thing which concerns itself with like non-materiality, with big questions about like evil and philosophy and metaphysics. But all of those big questions are, I suppose, enacted in the flesh. And that's why I think horror is this endlessly fascinating form. That's why I think monsters are this thing that we're endlessly drawn back to, because we're drawn to this concept of like limit experiences, right? We want to get taken out of ourselves. But that's a terrifying thing, but it's also something kind of incredible. We want to get taken beyond. I feel like this is all very like Cronenbergian, right? We want to get taken out. We want to get taken. We're in love with the flesh, but we want to get taken out of it.
Yeah. You're afraid of being created and destroyed, aren't you? Like,
Yeah.
you know, like that sort of, I really do have like that speech almost memorized. I want to get it completely memorized because I fucking love that whole thing.
Yeah.
I love the fly. I love the fly. Anyway, so but yeah, it's. I think when I write fiction, I write horror, and I don't write erotica because I think erotica is its own thing. But I'll tend to go in that direction because I feel like if I'm writing something and it doesn't do something to your body, what am I doing here? Like like that's
Right.
sort of that's yeah. Like
I mean,
I feel
this
like
is
yeah.
those three things. I think are all they're all kind of closer than maybe we'd like to admit, which is like
Oh
erotica,
yeah.
religious experience, and horror. Like the three things all share this idea of like it's about getting you out of yourself, right?
Yes.
This being trapped within the confines of our own bodies, of our own mind, of our own consciousness. That's how we live most of the day. But then there are things that can happen to us, or things that we can willingly participate in, which draw us out of ourselves, like throw us into this concept of something much bigger, and it's terrifying and exhilarating. Comedy is kind of
Comedy,
tangentially
yes.
related to that as well. This thing which kind of like jolts you out into a world which gets kind of transformed by it. But those three things I think are really closely related, which is the experience of horror, sex, and religion. Those are all kind of like bound up with one another in some really like often very complicated ways.
So we've talked a little bit about. I think we just touched a little bit with Frankenstein on the responsibility of the creator to the created as like writers, either of academic work or just of fiction. What responsibility do we have, like ethically, when we sit down to write? Which is kind of a broad question, but
Yeah, I think this is a super broad question. Like the idea of responsibility,
yeah,
of like what is the responsibility of the writer? It's not really about. I think this depends a lot upon what you think the relationship of art to social society is, right? So it's very tempting to be like, okay, well, the only responsibility the writer has is to write well, or to write honestly, and you know, the writer kind of exists as this separate figure from the social and political field in which they exist, and they kind of put their work out into it. And it's like that depends upon thinking that there is a kind of entirely autonomous realm for writing to exist within, right? If you think that writing is this kind of it exists outside of the political or exists outside of the social, then fine, you know, you could say that. If you don't believe that that's true, I think what you have to be willing to engage with is the complexity of art as a socially embodied practice. And what I mean then is like you can put intention into it, but there is a degree to which any kind of writing, as soon as it's, you know, it exists in the world, is in a way out of your control. Like as I think as a critic, you know, because that's often how I think of myself as a horror critic. The point is, horror is not intrinsically one thing. I don't think. I don't think horror is intrinsically left wing. I don't. It's often deeply reactionary, but I don't think horror is intrinsically right wing. I don't think I don't think it kind of can be mapped easily. I think what's important is being willing to contest and to see art as a kind of ongoing process. The work is not this kind of like perfect, hermetically sealed little bubble which gets dropped into the social field and then you just kind of leave it alone. I think what a work means and what it can do is something that those of us who write have to be engaged with the process of kind of contesting. Like, if this is how Horror Vanguard came to be, right? So we recognize that there's huge amounts of in horror that is misogynistic, that's politically reactionary, that's kind of often deeply ableist. And we're like, if we don't contest what horror can be, somebody else will, right? So, like, if you leave that cultural space open and go, oh, well, it's all this one thing, then the political right is going to take that and absorb it into their own kind of cultural imagination. And that's a colossal loss on every front. So the challenge becomes, how do we engage in kind of critical activity that refuses to just kind of give up on this cultural space? I guess there isn't a simple answer, right? There isn't a simple answer or a straightforward one, because all of this boils down to whether we are willing to engage with the process of meaning making as something that goes beyond the limits of making a single work, right? What Frankenstein means, or what the Saw movies might mean, is something that has to be worked out as part of the process of making sense of the work itself. Yeah, I think that's the best ad-lib response.
No, I did put you on the spot. I mean, part of why I put people on the spot on this is I want to know where their attention goes. You know what I mean? When they hear a broad question. I do worry, like, sometimes the conversation will say that the author has no responsibilities, and I'm not sure that makes sense to me because of what you said, that it creates writing as this separate social space which doesn't affect anything, which is like, why would we write if we didn't affect anything? That makes zero sense.
Right? Why would you bother? If you go, oh, well, it's not up to me how my work is received, like, well, what are you trying to do at all then? I think in a way it's a way of kind of like trying to isolate oneself from the political question of art, right? If you go, well, it's up to my readers, or it's up to my publishers to make sense of what this work means. It's like you're basically going, I don't really want to consider what I do as having any kind of political valence. And yeah, I think people maybe go, oh, isn't everything but when it comes to art, like, it always has been about politics as well. Like, and by choosing to not engage with the political valence of your writing, you're making a choice, right? You've already made the choice. Like, it's like Zizek says this all the time, which is like the choice to be non-ideological is like supremely ideological in nature. Like, you're making the ideal, you kind of like pinning your hopes on this ideological position that art is not even apolitical, but kind of transcends the political. And like maybe that was something that theorists were talking about back in the 50s and 60s. I'm like, it doesn't really seem to be a tenable position anymore. I think there are ways that maybe this comes down to like, are we willing to be didactic? People always go like, being didactic is really bad. Mm-hmm. But like we've always had the idea. I think you go back to sort of like ancient Greek writing. There was always this idea that actually art, usually theatre or poetry, did have a kind of moral function, right? You were, even if you weren't doing it explicitly, you were saying something about the moral or political field into which you were writing. And I think didacticism is not an excuse for bad writing, right? You can't go, oh, well, my novel is fine, even if it's a badly written novel, because it has good politics. I think, that, it doesn't really work. Because we've got lots of the novels with like quote unquote correct or good politics, which are just badly written and not interesting, or not trying to do anything other than sell quite well. so you immediately get into these complicated questions of like, what does it mean to write honestly and authentically? And I think that means that you have to have a realized and fully accepted the imperative to have a kind of moral or an ethical or a political perspective. And it doesn't have to be explicit, right? It doesn't have to be something that you foreground in your work. But if that is not part of what you are writing, I'm not sure how honest you're truly being as a writer.
I like Zizek talks a lot about how desire is constructed, which I'm sort of still chewing through, because I think it's almost self-evidently true. Like, yeah, we're taught how to look at things, we're directed where to look.
Mm.
But there's something about it that bothers me that I can't quite put my finger on, where I don't know, there's I think it's something to do with being, queer and disabled and all that. And like the moment I'm out as those things as a writer, there's suddenly an expectation where people start dissecting me
Mm-hmm.
and asking, like, are you the correct queer disabled
Yes.
person to
Yeah,
say
yeah.
this?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it start like the moment, like the expectation to be didactic a little bit starts weighing on me in terms of like, wait, my work might be that, but it's part of a conversation. It like the expectation that my work should stand alone and be the balm for all of society's ills, and that I must be perfect and all of that starts getting to the point where it's like, well, nobody lives up to that, so I guess we just live with some white men. That's fine. Not that there's anything wrong with white men. I love white men. Sometimes. Yeah. But it's there's the fact that I don't want my work talked about as if somebody's taking medicine.
Yeah, I mean,
makes
of
sense.
course. I think the problem is like if we this is where there is an antagonism, right? There's an antagonism between the artistic impulse and the political impulse. And I think one doesn't necessarily need to be subordinated to the other. Not necessarily. I think you have often art which is subordinated totally to political ends, right? It's very much concerned with being the right kind of thing, and a lot of it I don't necessarily feel all that enamored of. But also, there is art which is almost completely vacuous. I've been going back to the work of Alan Moore quite a lot. I think Alan Moore is a really good example of someone who has a very, very clear moral and political perspective in everything that they write. It's not even one that I would agree with all of the time, or I would not accept uncritically. But all of that is simply the filter through which imagination comes through, right? It's not. It isn't. All of his work is like is about ideas. It's about kind of like huge, sweeping, often very complex ideas, frequently put in mediums which were designed for like 14-year-olds to read. Like
Yeah.
there's something kind of like staggeringly ambitious about it, which I think is enormously kind of like exciting. But even though you read it and you know that Moore is this kind of like anarchist mystic who's really into William Blake and, a non-metaphysical reality and magic, you never feel like you're being kind of lectured to.
Mm-hmm.
So like this is what I mean, which is like the writer taking on the responsibility of occupying a certain positionality, of occupying a certain point of view, of being able to kind of clearly state, this is what I think about the world and why. That doesn't necessarily need to subordinate things like art or imagination or kind of weird creative risk. Those two things can coexist, but that friction can be generative, right? It can push work forward rather than being something that means the work you go, oh well, it's just didacticism. I think horror is a really good venue for this because horror often forces us to confront deeply unpleasant things, things that don't fit neatly into political, ethical or moral positions. Things that actually make us kind of question what that might be as well. I think, and sometimes people this is maybe why people don't like horror, or maybe why certain people don't like horror, is because it refuses the kind of safe harbor of easy answers, and so a lot of people go, oh well, I just won't engage with it then. But I think this is why I find horror so kind of like politically interesting, is because it is okay with the contradiction, right? How do you make art which is from a certain political standpoint? Often that takes you into places which are not pleasant. Often that presents you with very difficult conclusions, right? Things that maybe in other venues we would be kind of like reticent to talk about. Horror goes, no, confront it, deal with it. I think this is why horror is often very easily dismissed as being, oh, it's all reactionary, or it's all conservative, or it's all, and you go, no, it isn't. And maybe that's what worries people, that in horror's kind of like ambiguity and violence and kind of like ethically questionable moments, you go, I sort of recognize something, and that draws me to conclusions which are not entirely comfortable. You know, the political, especially in contemporary kind of popular culture discourse, political critiques of culture often boil down to like, is this the right kind of culture? You know, am I allowed to like this as a good, you know, social liberal, or, you know, based
Does
conservative?
This consumptive habit make me a good person?
Yeah, exactly. And horror is like staunchly uninterested in that question. Because it goes, well, you decided to engage with it anyway, and are you willing to take on all of the implications that brings up? You know, I think a lot of the time people fall into this. If you go, oh, all of horror is reactionary, and you go, well, what are you saying about all of the people who watch it? Are they all of them irredeemable reactionaries who, you know, hate women or enjoy watching violence against women? And you go, well, maybe some of them are, but like, is there anything else that's going on here? And if there is, what does that say? What does that say about these easy political taxonomies that we've constructed over the right kinds of cultural consumption?
Yeah, the House of the Dragon discussion's already getting real bad in terms of like, well, they'd portrayed misogyny, and it's horrific. Time to decide everybody like, yeah.
Yeah, time to just write it all off, because, and you go, are we not comfortable? We're certainly not comfortable with that ambiguity, right? With the instability that would actually force us to reflect upon our own taxonomical categories of art, and how we have tried to map everything into this very kind of consumer choice politics of like, this is the right, my consumption is good, therefore I am good. And actually, you know, one of the reasons I really love horror is that it makes you confront much harder questions about yourself. Not always. I mean, you know, sometimes you might go, well, it's just cheap, easy, disposable entertainment, but that's true of any kind of cultural form, right? Maybe Saw 3 is not posing super deep questions about... but also, if you start to think about it, you go, actually, all of this emerged at a very particular moment in cultural history, and none of this is accidental. None of this is an easy kind of political category that I can place it into neatly. You know, we talked about all of the Saw films on Horror Vanguard. We also talked about all of the Resident Evil films. And these are two, like, kind of, like, completely disposable franchises in many ways. But they're also, like, weirdly politically fascinating. precisely because they keep running into these contradictions kind of head first. So I guess to kind of circle back to the original question is like I don't really know. I don't think you can have a kind of like concrete one size fits all answer of like what is the writer's responsibility towards how their art is received. I think for I think honestly I think a really good first step would be to go actually writers have a responsibility. Right? That would be a really good first step.
Yes.
And beyond that, I think it is worked out in terms of the commercialization and capitalization of art. It's worked out in the kind of social field that you're writing into, the kind of art that you're trying to make, the kind of art that you decide that you want to emphasize, and the position of the writer. Your own political standpoint as someone who's decided to engage in any kind of creative practice.
I was when you were talking about some of what you were saying, I was thinking of Ajax, which I think was by Sophocles. It's this play that Aristotle didn't like. He thought it was not very good because it didn't provide catharsis, he thought. Ajax is driven mad by Athena. I don't remember why. He pissed her off for some reason. And he goes out into the night and slaughters all the cattle. He just goes mad. And in the morning, he's sort of tainted by this, and his wife knows that he wants to commit suicide, and she's like, "Don't you fucking dare. What's going to happen to us?" And he's like, "Fine, I won't. Fine, I won't." And then about a third of the way through, he does. And it's so in a lot of stagings, he's just left in the middle of the stage for the 2/3 of the play, while people argue over whose responsibility this was, like who caused this soldier, what caused his death, and there's not an easy answer. And like one of the things that a lot of modern productions get wrong is the play is supposed to be screamed almost the entire way through. People are supposed to scream at each other. And it's an incredible thing. And I feel like Aristotle like almost didn't get that this was horror. This is a horror play.
Yeah. Yeah. I really love that comparison. Like this idea of like this is what horror does, you know. It just leaves the body on the stage and goes, "Okay, deal with it." Like what will you do with this? And there's so much to critique in contemporary horror, in horror generally. You know, it's political reaction, it's misogyny, it's ableism. It can often be deeply, shockingly racist. But it's like, is that innate to writing horror as a form, or is horror as a form of writing or a form of media or a form of filmmaking something that emerges from particular social conditions, right? Are we being shown something which is symptomatic, right? And this is why I think horror is interesting for kind of like sort of very left-wing critiques of contemporary culture. You know, we talk about on Horror Vanguard we talk about this a lot. This idea of like a Gothic Marxism which kind of understands the fundamentally haunted nature of modernity, and like sees in those ghosts not things that we have to get rid of, you know, as good materialists, but actually things that help us understand the world that we exist in a much deeper way. And if we go, well, horror is all reaction, you know, Gothic is this outmoded kind of history we have to get past. We would never have bothered starting, right? You know, it would be about moving towards the great perfect future. So I really love that. I really love that kind of analogy for horror. You know, just dumping the body on the stage, right? All of the violence, all of the darkest stuff, which is normally just elided or hidden by political structures or social forces. Just put it right there, front and center, and people have to deal with this. when you were talking about it, it made me think a lot about John Carpenter's Halloween, which is just a great horror movie, and it's great precisely because it gives you this image of like perfect American domesticity, right? Perfect suburbia, and it just goes, you don't know, or rather, you don't want to know what's really happening behind all of those closed doors, right? There is this
The
deep,
thing we had to hide in order to.
yeah, this
Yeah.
deep kind of almost ontological violence is happening in the place where you think you're the safest. You think this is where the normal good people are. There is this kind of like deep well of like an almost cosmic force that kind of roils under the surface behind all the front lawns and the kind of like twitching net curtains. There's this void that's there, and you have to be able to deal with that.
I really appreciate about you, and I mean this sincerely. You can find horror in anything. Like I think you're very good at that. Do you think that's like a bent that you have like honed as an academic, or is that something that led you towards studying this?
I think maybe a bit of both. I think horror is really good at this process of denaturalization. And what I mean by that is like so much of the world that we exist in, we take to be just a kind of given, right? This is just the way things are. And horror is really good at going, actually, no. You know, there is the world is far stranger. And to kind of give I use this real world example quite a lot, which is like, I think most people have had this experience, or most people are going to have this experience. That one day, you'll be going about your day, and you'll get a phone call, and the phone call will be, someone you love is hurt. So like there's an act, something horrible, something horrifying has happened, and in that moment, I think you get kind of jolted into essentially a kind of new world. Anything else you're going to do that day doesn't matter. Doesn't matter, right? You know, you might have been going to work and you might have, like, 10 minutes before you were stressed about, am I going to make my commute? Am I going to, like, the world was just a kind of given, right? But what horror does is it's really good at going, actually, no, the world is this construct. We live stories for ourselves. And most of the time that's probably fine. But we need to be reminded, and I think this is why people are drawn to horror, is that the world is deeply contingent. It's this thing which presents itself as just a kind of like, this is just the way things are, but things are not just the way they are. Things are the way they are, and it's like a kind of like skin over the world, and it doesn't take much to kind of punch through it, and you get put into this kind of whole different kind of mental, emotional, even like existential condition. You know, and the reason that I think it's important to be aware of like finding the horror in things in a kind of tongue in cheek way maybe, is that it is a kind of really good way of going, actually, this is precisely not natural. This is just not this is not the way the world just is. The world is made. And as someone who is on the left, what that means is the world can be remade. Right? This is why I think horror has a kind of great political value. Is you go, well, what does horror show you? Is it shows you what you really care about. You know, the stuff that gets the strongest reaction out of you. Often it's like, to go back to that example I was using, do you really care about your job? Do you really care about making that 9 a.m. deadline? Or do you care about the person that you love? And it's like, horror shows that the world is so easily remade. And existing as we do in this kind of state of almost like political stasis, you know, what I've written about elsewhere is kind of like necro-neoliberalism, a system that is kind of like clearly not working, but is just sort of decaying publicly, and it's not really clear what the next thing will be. It's so important to be reminded in that visceral, physical way that horror can. Things can be different.
was thinking while you were talking about it. I have PTSD. It used to be very severe. It's now mostly subclinical, I'm told. But one of the things we talked about was like the intensive therapy was like you have had what started with you have had the veil of safety ripped away from your life. You can no longer live as if you are safe all the time. You can no longer do that. So how do we live now? That's what the therapy is. It's not about going back. It's about how do you talk about yourself? How do you talk about your life? And we talked about like in therapy, it was like weirdly sort of a revelatory experience. We talked about, okay, you can't tell stories about yourself anymore, right? You have no way of organizing what's happened, your life going forward into a narrative. And I think that's been that's been very helpful for me because they sort of relieved me of the responsibility of, they were like, there are certain events you don't have to know how to talk about ever. Mm-hmm. But there's definitely an element of like, if I attempted to talk about one or two events, I would start speaking in circles. I would start speaking very metaphorically. And it's not because I don't want to talk about it. It's because literally story breaks down, narrative starts breaking down. And so I recently read something you were writing about how horror is very metaphorical. Mm-hmm. And I was interested in your essay because you were like, metaphor is so important to horror.
Yeah, because certain things we can't talk about, right? Like it's certain. I am really interested in this kind of slippage between the cultural horror and actually what we might call the kind of existential or even like ethics of horror, right? Mm-hmm. Which is like how do we respond? Because I know so many people. Who deal with their own traumas or their own issues around mental health, who find horror as this incredible space, precisely for similar reasons, right? Because it allows us to give some sort of voice to what ordinary language kind of fails at talking about. Horror is always metaphorical, right? Because really horror is about what happens when language fails, right? What happens when we can't, like you said, right? You talk around. There's this kind of like shape of something, but you end up talking around it because it's not the language can't go through that, right? Or it can't do it in the way that would make it make sense. But horror is this thing that I think so many people get drawn to precisely because it allows, it gives a frame of reference for, the very kind of worst things that we can go through as kind of human beings, the sort of existential anxieties of just being a subject in the world. Can be almost unbearable, right? Can be almost kind of like desperately crushing. And I think horror gives us a kind of shape and expression to those narratives, and you can see the ways in which at certain moments our kind of collective anxieties find these shapes of catharsis. I've written about this previously in terms of like haunted house films, specifically after the 2008 mortgage crisis, and there was this huge upswing in the number of haunted house horror movies, homes that were literally possessed and were going to be repossessed, right? All of these things happening at the same time. It's like something comes out. I watched Jordan Peele's Nope recently, which is a really good movie, and in it he uses the term the bad miracle. Sometimes something can just fall out of the sky. It's like, and the world gets kind of cracked open. You can get a letter one day that tells you that you don't have a house anymore, right? And it's just come out of nowhere. And why? Well, because that's how this great machine of the economy works sometimes, and too bad for you. So it's not a surprise that all of this came out in horror, right? All of this kind of structural level, societal level, deep-seated anxiety and vulnerability and fear found its expression this way. And you can go, well, I think it's far too easy to go, well, these are just all scary stories. And you go, yeah, okay, maybe they're scary stories, but they don't just need to be just scary stories. They're scary. They provoke fear for a reason, right? And it's because there's a lot that goes into them that makes things scary.
So I think one of the things about Marxists that's really hard to live with as Marxist is I think that we, like, for instance, I'm a prison abolitionist. I don't think that when I talk to my mother-in-law, if she reads a story about a prison being brutal, I don't think it horrifies her in the same way. And I think there are a lot of things like that as, like, Marxists, where it's like, we don't see it as the default. We don't see it as the way the world is. And so we have to live with this horror. And it sort of makes it difficult. Do you have any thoughts on that, as somebody who studies this sort of thing, about how to live as a Marxist when choosing to live as a Marxist is sort of choosing to live with this monstrous situation that is not going to immediately resolve?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what is it? Terry Eagleton says this, which is like, it's Marxists are sort of like doctors in that we would wish very much not to have to be one, right? If you're a doctor, wouldn't you wish to live in a world where nobody needs to go and see the doctor anymore? And in a way, Marxists, all of us wish that one day we wouldn't need to be Marxists anymore, right? We would, because it would be done, right? Like, there would be a world that didn't run on exploitation and violence and extractive capitalism, and we could put down the banners and we could put away the great tomes of theory and just, take up gardening or whatever. I think to return this to the question of horror, right? The way that I think about it is that, and people might think that this sounds a little kind of too pat or too easy, but like, if horror shows us monsters, it shows us that monsters are not necessarily annihilatory, right? Horror is something that is fundamentally lived through, and there is something about that which is painful and awfully unfair, right? And kind of terrifying and heartbreaking in its contingency. But there is also something in that which is kind of utopian, right? Because it means that there is something that, like, a good horror film raises the suggestion that there's something that comes after horror. There's something that comes on the other side of it. And I think that's often something that we don't talk about a great deal. That there is something on the. This is why I've gotten super interested in the work of Ernst Bloch, who's the kind of great utopian thinker of Marxist philosophy. And Bloch wrote this. It's basically this enormous encyclopedia called The Principle of Hope. It's like 1,600 pages of this brilliant German philosopher cataloguing everything that he can find that he thinks points to what he calls the not yet, right? This idea that there are conditions which are not yet finished. Horror is not the end of the story. The Principle of Hope was originally going to be called Dreams of a Better Life, which I think is a great title for it. And he talks in it about everything from Goethe's Faust to Reformation theology to like daydreams to folk songs to theatre. All of these things possess what he called anticipatory consciousness, which is not just a kind of like idea that things could be different, but like that there could be something in the future that's better. And I think horror absolutely shows this potential, right? It has elements within it that even almost by their absence, they're there as a kind of like, oh, this isn't the whole story. We get reminded of that, I think, quite forcibly. And it's often very fragile. It's often a very contingent hope. But I think that horror film at its best does have this kind of utopian impulse, right? That horror is not the end of the story. That monsters are not necessarily there to completely destroy you, but maybe to show you a new way of living. There's a really interesting contemporary horror writer called Thomas Ligotti. Ligotti is known for being like infamously depressing, right? Like hugely depressing. This idea that the universe is like almost completely meaningless. There is a kind of existential bleakness just to being alive. But lots of Ligotti's stories are about characters who are confronted with the possibility of being changed into something else. And this transformation is terrifying, but it opens the door to something kind of new emerging. And the horror is that people get confronted with this choice and refuse it. They recoil away from it because it's too much to bear. And I think, in a way, to me, this is what horror does, is it presents us with choices of, like, what would it mean to be, not just even a different person, but a different kind of being, almost. What if we hadn't even yet arrived at being kind of human fully? And maybe people sometimes think about utopianism as being far too easy and straightforward. And I think horror actually puts the kind of, like, struggle back into the question of a utopian future.
Yeah, like I think about The Great Divorce a lot by C.S. Lewis. Like a bunch of people show up in heaven and they're not the kind of people who would like heaven. So they hate it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
It's sort of a violent process to be the kind of people who would fit into heaven, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, we live in a horror story, right? China Miéville has this other great quote, which is like, we already live in a utopia. It just isn't a utopia for us. It just isn't our utopia, right? For some people, this is the best of all possible worlds, right? But for us, it's a horror story. This again takes you into some really complicated ethical questions of, like, the role of revolution, of even revolutionary violence, of, like, what does that look like? What does it mean to actually become, Bloch has this great phrase about the desire for a world where all can walk upright for the first time, which is a very sort of, like, poetic way of putting it. But it's like, what does it mean? What would it mean to be one of those people? And it would probably mean that we would have to give up a lot about ourselves. Mark Fisher is very good on this, which is like the idea that maybe some people don't really want there to be... A revolution would be too much, right? If a genuine kind of, like, systemic break, all of those things that we would have to give up, all of those things that would just be gone, there is something terrifying about that, right? There's something kind of really, really frightening about that. So I think sometimes if we think about, like, a lot of the time it feels very bloodless, right? It feels very kind of like, well, when everything will be fine, and there won't be any problems anymore. And I think horror is a really good way of going, actually, is this something that you want? What are you prepared to give up? What would it cost you? Like, and it also at the same time holds open that door and goes, actually, there are things beyond this. There is something that goes beyond horror. Beyond the fear, beyond the kind of, like, physical affects that it can exert upon you. But is that something that you really want?
There's also something to, if you read history and if you look at, where climate change is going, I think you realize very quickly that the world becomes unrecognizable within a generation or two. Like, within your lifetime, the world will be so different that it will feel like by the end of your life, you're leaving a place you don't recognize anymore, that you don't necessarily feel you have a place in. And some of that is because we treat old people very poorly, but some of that is because the world changes so much and so rapidly. And it's like, I don't know, maybe like setting people down and saying, look, this world is going to be different. This world is dying. We are constantly on the verge of an apocalypse, and apocalypses are always happening. So the choice is not, do we want to preserve this world or not? Because the world is dying, and it's died every generation. Mm-hmm. It's what do you want it to look like next?
I mean, there's that there's that mistranslation of a Gramsci quote, which is the old world is dying and the new is struggling to be born, and in the interregnum of what is it Gramsci says, and I think that there's a vast array of morbid symptoms in that gap between something coming in, something ending, and something coming into being. There is I think it was Zizek who mistranslated it originally, said that now is the time of monsters. Monsters appear in that moment between the end of the world and the beginning of the world. All of these monsters come into being. To kind of pick up on what you were saying, I don't think it's a surprise that we're in the middle of a massive folk horror revival at the moment, right? When even the earth itself, the thing that we take the most for granted as just this thing which is always there and is the kind of frame of reference for us geographically and like politically, is starting to kind of become something which is hostile to us. Eugene Thacker calls it the world without us. Is that something that we can think? Can we think the world without us? The world is this place which is not something that like we get to use, but something that's even actively hostile to our presence. So this doesn't surprise me that right now, like I say, we're in the middle of a big folk horror revival. Where the natural world itself comes back as this thing which is strange and weird and completely out of our control.
I think that's all the questions I have for you. Thank you so much for joining me, unless there's something else you want to talk about.
No, I feel like I've talked way too much.
No, you did great. Thank you.